Who is the last pagan king to rule in Britain? I'm Ben Llewellyn, and today we're going to answer that question. Trying to assess who the last pagan king was in Britain is just not about plucking out a name and saying that's who it was. Because we have to assess, well, what are the parameters here? Are we talking about someone born and raised and became a king in Britain? Are we talking about someone who came to Britain and then was a king? And also, Christianity came into the British Isles in different waves, which made it very unique to other parts of Europe. But to answer the question, in Anglo-Saxon England, we have King Otterwald, the king of the Isle of Wight. And this is quite early, the 7th century, when the last pagan king of Anglo-Saxon times is extinguished. But that's not the last pagan king in these isles, certainly. And it's certainly not the last pagan king in Britain. To answer that, we have to go forward into the Viking Age, almost to the year 1000, about the year 900. I have to show you what was going on these islands, generally, at that time, and the cultural mixture that allowed this specific pagan king, Eric Bloodaxe, to rule more than once during the middle of the 10th century. Britain in the 10th century was a hodgepodge, a patchwork of kingdoms with different cultural identities and different languages. Not even the same language within what would be England today, certainly. So you had Cornwall. Let's start and go all the way through them. Cornwall down here at the bottom, southwest, was still a minor kingdom up until the earlier, almost mid-10th century. Wessex in southern England would eventually dominate. In Wales, you had a patchwork of kingdoms that amalgamated and broke apart several times. You had Anglic kingdoms along the east, and you had Northumbria, which had expanded rapidly and become an immensely large kingdom by about 700 AD. But Viking attacks and internal divisions began breaking it apart in the 9th century, and this is a process that continued into the time of Eric the Bloodaxe and allowed him to become king, which we'll explain in a moment. In the north you had the Britons, the men of Strathclyde, a kingdom which began to re-emerge, and you had the Irish kingdom of Dalriada to the north, and still faint echoes, probably by this time you had the Picts, but they were on their way out with the Vikings coming in. And when the Vikings come in, that's when we need to explain a few elements of history that allowed what happened with Eric Bloodaxe to happen. In 866, the Vikings took York. This allowed other kingdoms to begin expanding, but the Vikings didn't stop there. In 870, the Norse attacked Alt-Cleed, the stronghold of Strathclyde. And after this, something strange happens. You have the men of Strathclyde expanding south and east at the expense of the now breaking up kingdom of Northumbria. And so the Britons are actually expanding their power. And in 886, King Guthrum the Old, who is ruling York, is baptized. And he establishes a peace treaty with Wessex. And this creates a more established Viking kingdom in Northumbria on top of the old Saxon. And from this period up until 927, the men of Strathclyde are expanding southwest. And the internal politics of Northumbria are very shaky. You have quite a few kings in a row that are killed, and you have people taking power as they can. And in 927, King Aethelstan, the king of Wessex, takes York. For a time it seems like Northumbria is going to settle down, but the people of the north don't take kindly to Aethelstan's rule. Things don't last in this semi-broken peace. The people of the north and the other peoples of these isles want to stop Wessex before it can become too big to And so Owain, king of Strathclyde, Constantine, the king of Scotland, and Olaf Guthrason, remember that name for later, they joined forces and tried to invade England. And Aethelstan wins a battle at Brunanburh, but it's not so one-sided as people like to make out. Yes, it allowed Aethelstan hegemony and to further extend his power north, but Brunanburh left a lasting resentment in the north. This is the world into which Eric the Bloodaxe would come. As you can imagine, we don't really know much about his early life, given it was the early 10th century, and he came from beyond the periphery of what was the Christianized world. What we have comes from three main sources. Well, four, I'll get to the fourth in a moment. But you have the life of Saint Cathro, which I'll get to that person later on. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is quite an important source for the Saxon language and just the time period. And also something called skaldic poetry, which maybe I'll do a video on if you're interested, but it's basically the Viking poetry tradition. We also have the sagas, which are less reliable by far, which evolved in Norway and across the North Atlantic into Iceland. Eric the Bloodaxe, according to Heimskringla, that's a saga, or a collection of sagas, and Egil's saga. Eric Bloodaxe was spending a lot of his early time with a herdsir, a Viking military commander, sailing often around the Baltic and other places within the vicinity of the Viking world, you know, pillaging and burning stuff, as you do. He is the son of Harald Fairhair, who was the founder of a dynasty, an early Norwegian dynasty in the West Fjords, which really is a cradle of Norwegian royal lineage and heritage. Now, contrary to what people might think, the early Norwegian kingdom was kingdoms, plural. This was not a singular country, but the area that encompassed Harald Fairhair's kingdom and later Eric Bloodaxe was the dominant group for a long time. That's really important. It's not where Oslo is that became the first cradle of the Norwegian kingdom. It was the West Fjords. And to understand Norway, by the way, you need to understand that. He had between 11 and 20 sons, and Eric Bloodaxe was one of them. In Norse, Eric Bloodaxe's name was, I guess that's Bloodaxe. Don't quote me on that. But he had other supercats or nicknames. Fratrum Interfector, Brother Bane or Brother Killer, Sequina Securus, Bloody Axe. And that bloody, that didn't mean bloody in battle so much as blood relations. And having between 11 and 20 brothers, according to legend, he may have killed all of them except one. We don't know. So that may be what Bloodaxe means. You also get other names for him in the Norse and Icelandic sagas. Harald's Altar, Harold's lineage, and Halfdanar, which is the descendant of Halfdan, the father of Eric's father. So having so many nicknames, this man, after his death, entered popular culture as a folk hero. His image and memory became distorted. We do know, though, that there's no proof of this king being Christian, which is very odd. And it's very likely because he came from a still pagan country, which was on the eve of Christianization. He was moving ahead of that wave, but it would be very conspicuous for a Christian king in this era to not have it mentioned. Now, we don't have many of the names of these sons, but Hakon Gothi was one we do know of the sons of Harald, not Eric Bloodaxe. And he, we think, was sent to Aethelstan's kingdom in England because Hakon was the youngest, which meant that he could be easily killed off by his brothers because fratricide was quite common because if you wanted the kingship, you know, you gotta take out those, don't you? In any case, Hakon was likely raised for much of his early days in a Christian kingdom, very contrary to Eric Bloodaxe. And when Haraldfather passed and Eric Bloodaxe assumed the throne, which he did, in the early 930s, then Hakon came back to Norway. He may have come with Athelstan's blessing and with resources and men to take the kingdom back and to begin to spread Christianity. We don't know. Or he may have come of his own volition. In any case, what happened is that he figured out how to incentivize the nobility to join him and turn against his brother by incentivizing them with tax reductions and financial benefits for joining his side. Eric the Bloodaxe could not resist this, and he saw this clearly, and he and his family fled rather than face a conflict they would clearly lose. We think he fled, Bloodaxe, to Orkney. Now, the Earls of Orkney had a long history already by this point, a Norwegian aristocratic line that had taken over. A couple of these earls appear to be in his immediate circle in his second reign as King of Northumbria, but at this point in the mid-930s, he had not been King of Northumbria yet. He had just had to flee and lose his throne as the King of Norway, or the western part of it anyway. He aligns with these Earls of Orkney, and there's brief mention of him, if I remember correctly, in the Orkney saga. Now, between this period in the early mid-930s, maybe 934, and the year 946, we don't really know much about what he's doing or where he is. We do know, however, what's going on in Northumbria itself. Northumbria has 5 kings in 7 years. That's quite chaotic. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to hit that like button and please subscribe if you're not. And there are a couple important names among these 5 kings to understanding Eric Bloodaxe's life. One of them is Olaf Guthrason, King of Dublin, earlier, and he's very much a pro-Viking element. You also have Olaf Sigtryggsson, who comes back in later. And the kings of Wessex have a go. Edmund of Wessex, who died in a pub brawl during this period, rules over Northumbria briefly. It's very unorganized. There's a lot of interregnum kind of anarchy going on. And in 946, King Edred comes to the throne further south in Wessex, and he sees this weakness going on in the north. He's like, well, maybe here's my chance to get rid of these pesky Vikings. And he puts Olsuf in charge as a high reeve, kind of a Saxon or a magistrate in Bramber Castle. And this man begins to administrate the kingdom on behalf of King Edred. And the people of North, they don't really like this very much. And they're a bit rowdy. And King Edred comes north and is like, well, wait, you have to be my subjects now, or else, well, I'll just burn things down. And they're like, well, okay, if you put it that way, you know, we'll swear allegiance to you. Just calm down. And so he meets them at what's called then Tanshilf, but what became known as Pontefract. And they swear allegiance to him there, and he goes back south, but then they turn around and say, you went back south, we're going to elect our own king. And they choose Eric Bloodaxe. Now, we don't know the exact circumstances of this. Did he just show up and say, you're not big enough to stop me? Or did he just already have plans in place to manipulate the different factions, which were obviously going in a tide against Wessex and already disorganized between each other? Probably a bit of both. He shows up and becomes king in 947. Now, this first reign is quite short. The king for the south probably does not like having a pagan ruler. Though we don't really have evidence he was pagan, we clearly have no evidence he was Christian, which is rather conspicuous for the age. King Edred launches a raid north, and he focuses his attacks on a place called Ripon. And he does this for a reason, because he's trying to lure the nobles out of their allegiance to Eric. This doesn't work at first, so he turns to a more open battle, and he suffers heavy losses. And then he changes tactics and directly attacks the property of those nobles. They're like, well, wait a minute. If you do not yield to me, I will burn your property. Well, if you put it that way, I mean, don't burn my house down, it's quite expensive. Declare my puppet your king, and we'll be even. Well, we don't really like him, but we'll agree for now. And so the nobles agree to renounce Eric as their king, and King Edred has this man, Olsuf, promoted to Earl, and then Citrixon, who's the king of Dublin, is invited back to Northumbria to be a king of Northumbria. That's all a bit shady, a bit of underhanded dealings going on. And Eric the Bloodaxe is not killed. We don't really know what he's doing in this period between 948 and 952 quite. There are some battles that take place up north, raids kind of things, he may have been involved. And there's a bit of unclarity in 952. Several things happen at once. We know Citrixon is ruling with Edred's blessing, and Olsuf is advancing further as an earl. However, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that year, 952, state the Northumbrians drove out King Olaf and accepted Eric, son of Harold. That same year, the Annals of Ulster state there was a victory over the men of Scotland and the Welsh and the Saxons who invaded Northumbria. It seems probably the most probable thing is that Eric Bloodaxe exploited the chaos to retake his throne. If you'd been king before, why couldn't you be king again, right? And he began trying to consolidate things very quickly because he knew he only had a short window. He couldn't let this happen like last time. And he does manage to reign for a bit longer this time. I want to mention here about his wife. We know that his wife was related to King Dyfnwal of Strathclyde, the Britton, and that she was a relative of Cadra, or Cathra in some sources. And this name is interesting because the first element clearly comes from Cad, the word for to battle in Welsh. We're not sure what the other bit means. It's probably been distorted by other languages. And the fact that he married a Britton woman suggests he was trying to build alliances with the kingdom of Strathclyde, because these people were in need of friends as well, and them being both between the Scots and the Saxons, they were trying to create a polity that could withstand both of them. And they nearly succeeded, it seems. But King Edred had a magistrate named Olsuf, which I'll get to in a moment. We think Olsuf was quite conspiratorial in the demise of others. 952, 53, 54, almost 3 years, more like 2. He mints coins in his name, which is, I mean, that's quite prestigious to have a coin with your name on it, right? However, Olsuf is still there in the background, and King Edred further south is trying to put pressure on him, and it appears that several plots to remove him take place. And one of them pushes him out, and he begins to flee, and he fights a battle in a place called Stanmore. And before we get to that, we have to assess where he was going and where he had been. There's a pass between the old kingdom of Northumbria and the land of the Britons. This goes between Cumbria and Yorkshire, and this had been the ancient meeting ground. I mean, there's tales of battles here going back to the 6th century between kingdoms. And he runs through the land of an earl named Maccus. And we think he's on the way to wherever his wife came from. We're not sure. Possibly political allegiances that polity that I mentioned with Strathclyde and trying to get help, we don't know. However, there's a man named Roger of Wendover who came around 250 years later who wrote this about what happened there. The king was treacherously killed by Earl Maccus in a certain lonely place which is called Stanmore, with his son Hayek and his brother Ragnald betrayed by Earl Ulsuf, and then afterward King Edred ruled these districts. What seems to have happened is that when Eric Bloodaxe took power the first time, he made an enemy because he threatened Ulsuf's job as a high-ranking magistrate with quite a lot of administrative and political influence. He probably lost his cushy political job and then was able to regain it through King Edred. And I don't think Ulsuf ever forgot this, and he wanted vengeance. He wanted revenge. Very cutthroat. Afterwards, King Edred makes Ulsuf Earl not just of Bramber, but all of Northumbria. Ulsuf didn't do bad for himself, did he? He was quite cunning. He's basically the king of Northumbria in all but name under King Edred. So he kind of got his payback on Eric Bloodaxe. Going back to the religious significance of this video, there's no real evidence for what he believed one way or the other, Eric Bloodaxe. There's no consecrated churches. There's no talk of if a Norwegian king came to Britain and became Christian, the clerics and scribes at the time would have made a big boast and show of it, because it would have been a source of political propaganda to use against their enemies. But if he was pagan, well, you wouldn't want to mention it, would you? And for those of you who clicked on this video wanting to know more about paganism in Britain, the simple and sad truth is, the Christian scribes, this is what they did. They kept leaving it out until it was erased. You didn't cover it up so much with lies at those times as you left it out. And maybe that's the surest evidence we have that Eric Bloodaxe was pagan and did not convert. There's no propaganda saying otherwise, which you would expect. Today's question, the Kingdom of Northumbria, what do you think its main language would have evolved into? It was ruled by Norse and had Norse speakers in it. It had speakers of Welsh in it. It had speakers of Saxon and what would have become Scots in it. What do you think would have become its language? Diolch yn fawr o gwylio. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.